Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about strategies for social change and more specifically looking at awareness raising of privilege. So in this case, I'm going to focus on where raising awareness about colonialism to mainly white settlers. So for today, I decided not to follow a traditional presentation. So I won't be presenting my method, the results. Uh, well, kind of be jumping straight into the discussion section of my thesis. So I won't be presenting my results themselves, but more some of the reflections that came from these results, again, focusing on social change. I will still briefly present myself and the research project. Um, so the guiding questions I want to focus on today are, is awareness raising of privilege a relevant strategy? In what context and conditions, and especially at what costs. So I'll be discussing iatrogenic effects a lot. So the idea of having unintended negative impacts that go against our goal. So in this case, we're trying to do something anti-colonial, but are we reproducing colonialism or having negative impacts on indigenous peoples? So is it a necessary first step or more of a distraction, as in distraction politics? So for the context, my name is Kai Henfield. My pronouns are they, them, yeah, avec les accords masculins. I'm a white settler, descendant of Irish and English settlers from more than 300 years ago. And I come to this with a positive bias towards awareness raising as someone who experienced this process myself and was uh, obviously deeply changed by it. I had this idea that we need to give everyone the opportunity to gain critical awareness. Um, of course, my perspective has changed a little. I understand now that it's not gonna work for everyone. But still, that's two pieces I wanted to mention about how I came to this project. And basically, I wanted my thesis to be relevant to answer a concrete need. So I offered my research to Mikana and decided to creating a partnership with them since 2020, so before I started my PhD. And they wanted to first look at the experience of the indigenous youth giving the workshops, the ambassadors. Again, uh, thinking together about this risk of we don't want to be having a negative impact on the marginalized people giving the workshops. And then looking at the impact on the mainly white settlers receiving the workshop. So for the study, we focused on the first mandatory workshop that they give, so the 101. So it's a 3-hour workshop where they first introduce some historical events of colonialism, their ongoing impacts, so understanding current inequalities as a result of colonialism, and then ending with resurgence to step away from this idea of indigenous peoples as past. So that's for the context. And then there's three main ideas I want to bring in conversation today. So first, I also did a project with the Circle of First Nations at UQAM. So the same idea, I offered my research skills to them, and they wanted to look at the university policies addressing First Peoples in Quebec. So, spoiler alert, there are none, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. Um, One thing that came out of this project is that institutional change without individual change creates iatrogenic effects. So, a great example of this is Brunette de Bassige, who did her thesis on Indigenous women hired in leadership positions in Canadian universities to implement Indigenous action plans. Okay. And what she found is that they experience so much microaggressions and labor of educating the white settlers that are already present in those institutions that within a year, more than a third of them ended up quitting, and even the ones that stayed experienced those violences, those dynamics of assimilation or quitting or being excluded. So what this shows is how microaggressions can undo institutional and political gains and have iatrogenic effects, not only by harming those indigenous women, but also by preventing them from bringing the change that they could have brought, and also making it harder to then push for change within those same institutions because they will say, no, we've already done it, or like we've already done it and it doesn't work. And this idea of the labor of educating and microaggressions is the foundation of Mikana. So their first objective is to reduce those microaggressions and the education that Indigenous peoples have to do in their daily lives. So then, when we look at the experience of the ambassadors, they do report a lot of those difficulties during the workshops, right? The questions, the prejudice, the microaggressions, the dealing with the feelings of the participants, walking on eggshells, and that does affect them. They can doubt themselves, feel frustration, hopelessness, but even if they report all of this, they still say that the workshops don't have a negative impact on them. They say it's fine, it's not so bad. And the reason for that is again because facing white settlers in their daily lives is worse than doing it in the workshops. So these first two results are rooted in the omnipresence and prevalence of colonial aggressions. So Mikana is a strategy to deal and make the best out of this imposition. And that's the reason also why the ambassadors say that, doing it in the workshops is fine because when they're in the workshops, they have support from Mikana. They're in a team, they're in a position of authority. They have mechanisms in place if it doesn't go well. They have safety protocols. They're paid. They have resources, all these things. So basically, the ambassadors feel much safer and it's um, much less bad. It's not as bad to do it in the workshops than when they're by themselves at the grocery store, for example. So now, if we look, okay, what does it do for the white settlers receiving those workshops? After 3 and 6 months, we can see generally that there is an increase in knowledge and awareness about colonialism. People will say that it has changed their prejudice and will talk about a desire to do something or to do more. But it's only a minority that within those few months will actually engage in further education and action, which is the goal of awareness raising. We're trying to sow a seed that will keep growing. So if we look at all of this, we could say that it's kind of a failure. But I'm suggesting that this is not a failure. This is exactly what we can expect from such a workshop. Again, this is just a one-time 3-hour training. So this is the best we can ask from such an initiative. And the other reason why I'm saying it's not a failure is rooted in this Moyer's model of social change. So really, in both cases, the goal is to reduce resistance for most people. That's all we're going to do for most people. To gain passive agreement, so they're not actively opposing a racist comment, but they're like, So this for some people, let's say 30%, and then gaining active support for the fight for a minority, maybe a 10% of people. So the idea is to create a mass of people that are at least not actively resisting the struggle and create a mass that's gonna be easier to push further and will allow the movement to move through those different stages. So to situate ourselves here, I'm suggesting that we can understand the general Indigenous movement in Quebec as being around stage 6. So the reason for that is because we've had a few trigger events, such as Joyce Echaquan, which has led to a drastic increase of uh, Indigenous people being discussed in settler media and discourses. And there is a general agreement that there is a problem. it's not to the level we want it to, or not the way we want people to understand exactly, but still most people have heard about Joyce and would agree that it's a problem. So this stage is also something, this experience of going from being completely invisible to being highly discussed is something that the ambassadors talk about. Like they've experienced this themselves as 20, 30-year-old youth. And the downside of this movement, of course, is performative approaches, tokenism, um, and an assimilation of the discourse. So, in this case, we can think of, for example, with the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yeah. Basically, the risk at this stage is for these tendencies to create an illusion of change while not really changing anything, which can allow people to go back to stage one, to business as usual, because it's the ticking the box effect, right? And this is the risk of the workshops as well. It's like, okay, we've solved the problem, back to business as usual, but really nothing has changed. And this means that we'll have to redo the whole process again. So this is what the activist failure, the movement failure is. This is where it lies. But what Moyer highlights is that we often fail to understand this stage as a win in itself. So if, for example, the government is using reconciliation and reconciliation has become so widespread in universities and governments and municipalities, it's because there is a general agreement that this is needed. So it means that we've won the majority of the public, and there's enough pressure for the government to appropriate the discourse. So it means that the there's been a shift where they're the ones trying to use our words to maintain the status quo. So basically, what we need to do at this stage is to be careful not to allow this illusion of change to happen. Make sure we keep mobilization, and then make sure we actually push through those final stages of real transformative change and paradigm shifts, which is the success, right? So if I go back to the workshops, because that's what I'm working on, that means going for series of ongoing in-depth trainings. So going from, the awareness raising, information, all these things, the 101 is needed, but having a real series that goes all the way through accompanying concrete change in those individuals and those institutions, because the workshops are always given to groups of people and it's often in a workplace, so it allows to establish more institutional change as well, so going from individual to institutional change. So now that I've said all this, I'm suggesting that changing minds and reaching the privileged is insufficient but necessary. So we all know that individual level action and simply agreeing with a cause is insufficient for change. Similarly, mobilizing the privileged will almost always fail, at least partially. Yet it seems inevitable to deal with those two things when we're trying to do social change. And failure to consider them seems to lead to iatrogenic effects with microaggressions or backlash. So in this case, we can think of the current dismantling of the EDI movement in the States. So we can see how an individual, of course supported by various organizations such as Project 2025, can dismantle institutional gains because by creating moral panics, because the public opinion was not won, or because the myths that underlie the status quo were not deconstructed deep enough. So it makes it easier for the right to appeal to those myths, those narratives, to create backlash. So in this case, meritocracy. So I'm suggesting that awareness raising may be a partial solution to reduce resistance and prevent backlash. So, in conclusion, will settlers and colonizers make the revolution? No. Can mobilizing them play a role in reducing barriers? Yes. But, as I've said, awareness raising can play a relative role, and we should invest them accordingly. That is, if they contribute 10% to the fight, maybe we should invest in them 10%. And regardless, we need to better understand them and their role to mobilize them more strategically. The other thing is that awareness raising needs to be done extremely well. So there's a lot of conditions and things to be put in place to even have a chance at changing the minds of the privileged and make sure we're not harming the marginalized people doing the work. So, I'm not gonna dive into everything that Mikana does, but it needs to be first people's first. So it needs to benefit and center the indigenous people first. So in this case, Mikana has a strong culture of care, and they offer a lot of they go way beyond the workshops. So the ambassadors, the main thing that they say is that they get community. They get access to an indigenous community that is the center of all the positive impacts that they get from doing the workshops. Healing, recognition to their indigenous identities, having access to, by having access to cultural activities, for example. So, all this to say that awareness raising done well can contribute to social change and should not be completely discarded or promoted as the ultimate solution. Thank you.